It was the summer of 1943. The air hung heavy with the distant echoes of war, as the rolling fields of an American POW camp seemed almost untouched by the chaos raging across Europe. Sunlight streamed through the tall, wooden windows of the mess hall, dust motes floating lazily in its golden rays, and the scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling bacon drifted through the air. Outside, rows of neatly arranged tents swayed gently in the breeze, each a small island of order amid the uncertainty of wartime life. Inside, a group of Italian women, prisoners of a conflict they had never fully chosen, gathered cautiously around long, polished wooden tables. Their eyes widened as they were presented with plates brimming with food so different from the rations they had known back home. Fluffy loaves of bread, creamy butter, glistening fruits, and desserts that seemed to shimmer with promise. Every bite was a revelation. There was astonishment in the silence between them, punctuated by soft gasps, nervous laughter, and the tentative clinking of metal trays. For these women, accustomed to scarcity and the daily struggle of survival, the abundance before them was almost unbelievable. Each dish was a story, each flavor a reminder that, even in captivity, the world could still surprise them. This was not just nourishment, it was a moment suspended in time, a fleeting taste of comfort, and a rare glimpse of humanity in the midst of war. And in those eyes, wide with disbelief, one could read a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and an almost childlike wonder at the strange and beautiful variety of American food. The moment the first course arrived, the air inside the mess hall shifted in a way that seemed almost imperceptible at first, like the quiet stirring of a breeze that ruffles leaves. Then it became impossible to ignore. The clatter of trays, the muted shuffle of feet, the low hum of whispered curiosity. These sounds punctuated a scene that had, until now, been defined by routine, by scarcity, by an almost numbing familiarity with hunger. For the Italian women, prisoners of a distant war, the experience that unfolded before them was nothing short of extraordinary. Each tray, meticulously arranged, carried an array of food so vivid, so full of life, that it seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the stark, rationed meals they had known in Europe. The wooden tables stretched endlessly, polished and gleaming under the sunlight that filtered through the tall windows, and upon these tables rested dishes that seemed almost to glow in the quiet light, mountains of steaming potatoes, golden roasted chickens with skin crisped to perfection, bowls of vegetables so fresh that the colors almost hurt the eyes, deep orange carrots, bright green beans, ruby red tomatoes glistening as if kissed by morning dew. The aroma hit them first, a heady symphony of scents that mingled and swirled around the room like invisible ribbons. The warmth of roasted meat, the earthy scent of fresh potatoes, the delicate sweetness of just steamed vegetables, and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread combined to form something wholly unfamiliar and yet deeply alluring. A few of the women froze in place, hands clutched over aprons or against their chests, as if the act of breathing itself might somehow betray their disbelief. Their eyes darted from plate to plate, absorbing the scene with a mixture of awe and apprehension. It was not rations, it was not sustenance forced upon them in measured portions. This was abundance, care and artistry distilled into food, presented without ceremony but with undeniable intent. Some hesitated at first, unsure if it was permissible to reach, if it was allowed to partake in this unexpected bounty. Their cultural upbringing, the ingrained lessons of decorum and modesty, and the conditioning of war all collided in the small, silent pauses they allowed themselves. A few timidly extended their hands toward a plate, fingers brushing the warmth of roasted potatoes, only to retreat as if startled by the softness of the spuds or the sheen of the buttery skin on the chicken. Others, emboldened by curiosity and hunger alike, dove in without hesitation, their faces lighting up as the first bites touched their tongues. There was a momentary, almost magical, stillness as each woman processed the flavors, the crisp outer layer of the chicken giving way to tender, juicy meat, the potatoes melting softly against the tongue, infused with the subtle fragrance of herbs, the vegetables, cooked to perfection, still retaining a faint, fresh snap that spoke of their careful preparation. The contrasts, the textures, and the richness of the flavors were overwhelming, and yet exhilarating, forcing even the most reserved among them to smile, to nod, to whisper softly to their companions, words tumbling out in awe and delight. The table became a stage, and the women, the unwitting actors in a performance orchestrated by the simple brilliance of food. Their expressions shifted continuously, astonishment giving way to delight, delight giving way to hesitant laughter, and laughter looping back into silence as new flavors appeared and were sampled. Every dish seemed to carry its own story, from the humble potatoes, perhaps reminding them faintly of home, cooked meals left behind, to the roasted chicken, seasoned with a care and subtlety they had rarely encountered. Each spoonful and bite held a dual significance, nourishment for the body, and a gentle reminder that life, even amidst the shadow of war, could hold small moments of beauty and surprise. They talked quietly among themselves, their voices blending with the gentle clinking of metalware, sharing observations about tastes and textures, about the softness of the bread, the delicate seasoning, the sheer novelty of what was before them. Even in these small exchanges, a sense of camaraderie began to form, a quiet recognition that they were experiencing something extraordinary together. Beyond the taste, there was a visual feast that seemed to demand attention. The dishes were not only abundant, but meticulously presented. Piles of golden potatoes were arranged with care, not haphazardly dumped onto plates. Roasted chickens were whole, glistening, and inviting, as though each one had been prepared to capture a moment of perfection. Vegetables were sliced and steamed just enough to retain both color and structure, creating a spectrum of greens, oranges, and reds that caught the light like jewels strewn across the wooden tables. Even the bread, stacked in neat rows, released tendrils of warmth and the subtle scent of freshly kneaded dough. The mess hall itself seemed transformed, a space of mundane captivity elevated to a theater of sensory wonder. Sunlight streamed through the windows in soft beams, illuminating the plates and the faces of the women with a natural, cinematic glow. Shadows danced lightly on the walls, flickering with the movement of hands reaching, trays being lifted, and eyes widening in disbelief. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, a quiet miracle where the ordinary act of eating became an event both profound and cinematic. There was a rhythm to the scene, almost musical in its unfolding. The women reached, paused, tasted, whispered, and laughed in turns. The clinking of cutlery against plates became a soft percussion, punctuating the quiet gasps and murmurs of wonder. With each passing minute, initial hesitation gave way to confident exploration. Hands moved more freely. Forks dipped eagerly into vegetables. Slices of chicken were broken apart and sampled. Potatoes were buttered and passed along the table. Some of the women experimented, combining flavors in ways that suggested a tentative rediscovery of pleasure in food, while others savored each element in isolation, letting the texture, warmth, and seasoning speak to them. Even the most cautious among them could not resist the temptation to reach again and again, driven by a mixture of hunger, curiosity, and that almost childlike amazement that only comes when one experiences abundance for the first time. And yet, amidst the delight, there was a subtle undercurrent of emotion that made the scene far more than a simple feast. These women, far from home and far from freedom, were confronting a form of care and generosity that had no immediate explanation in the grim logic of war. Each bite was imbued with complexity, joy tinged with disbelief, relief shadowed by lingering tension, and gratitude mixed with an almost guilty astonishment at their fortune. The simple act of sharing a meal under such circumstances became a profound connector, binding the women together in a quiet, wordless acknowledgement of what it meant to be seen, even briefly, as human beyond the label of prisoner. Their eyes met across tables laden with food, and in those glances a silent dialogue unfolded, understanding, wonder, and the shared realization that something rare and unexpected had entered their lives. Time seemed to bend around them. A meal that might ordinarily have been routine stretched into an experience that encompassed every sense. Flavors, aromas, textures, colors, gestures, and glances intertwined to create a tapestry of astonishment. Each bite seemed to carry a tiny revelation, each dish a fragment of narrative, each shared laugh a note in a quiet symphony of emotion. For the Italian women, accustomed to the strict rationing and scarcity of wartime life, this abundance was not merely nourishment. It was a story told with care, a fleeting reprieve from the realities outside the mess hall walls, and a small, unforgettable miracle of human kindness expressed through food. By the time the first course ended, there was a lingering, almost reverential quiet. Plates were emptied, yet none of the wonder had dissipated. Conversations softened, eyes lingered on trays that once seemed impossibly abundant, and the women absorbed the lingering warmth, both from the food and from the extraordinary sensation of experiencing something so utterly generous. In that quiet aftermath, one could almost feel the invisible threads of humanity being woven between captor and captive, between expectation and reality, between hunger and the extraordinary gift of sustenance. The simple act of eating, amplified by abundance, care, and meticulous presentation, had become a moment of quiet, cinematic transcendence. When the desserts arrived, a hush fell over the mess hall that was almost palpable, as if the women instinctively understood that this was no ordinary part of the meal. Plates glimmered with the promise of indulgence, arranged carefully to highlight each treat as if it were a small work of art. Pies with golden, flaky crusts, still warm from the oven, seemed to beckon with a silent invitation. Cakes of varying heights and textures, some layered and frosted in delicate swirls, others simple yet elegant, rested beside glistening bowls of fresh fruit salad whose colors seemed almost too vivid to be real, deep purples of grapes, ruby reds of strawberries, bright orange segments, and pale green slices of melon that caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. There were puddings, rich and creamy, dusted with just enough powdered sugar to glint under the soft morning light, their surfaces smooth and inviting. The air itself seemed to hum with the sweetness, carrying the faint aroma of vanilla, butter, and sugar that had been baked into each creation, mingling with the lingering scent of the earlier courses in an intoxicating symphony. For many of the women, this was the first time they had encountered such variety and care in a single meal. Some leaned closer to their trays, wide-eyed, their hands hovering above the desserts as if afraid that a single touch might shatter the fragile magic of the moment. Others exchanged glances with companions, whispers of incredulity slipping past their lips, words in Italian, soft and trembling with delight, punctuated by laughter that was almost childlike in its freedom. One woman tentatively pressed her spoon into a slice of layered cake, breaking the delicate frosting and revealing the soft, pillowy layers beneath. She lifted it to her lips slowly, savoring the moment, and as the sweetness hit her tongue, a gasp of astonishment escaped her. The taste was unlike anything she had known, rich but balanced, delicate yet profoundly satisfying. It was not merely sugar, it was care, creativity, and the subtle artistry of someone who understood not only the mechanics of cooking but the emotional power of food. The reactions spread quickly across the hall. A woman reached for a slice of fruit tart, the vivid red berries glistening as she pressed her fork through the buttery crust, releasing a faint aroma of jam and cooked fruit. Another dipped delicately into a bowl of chocolate pudding, the creamy texture coating her spoon with every spoonful. Eyes widened, eyebrows lifted and small. Almost imperceptible shivers ran through the women as the flavors unfolded. It was as if each bite contained a secret, a story waiting to be discovered. A childhood memory evoked by the tang of citrus, a comforting warmth recalled in the smoothness of custard, or a shared delight in the crispness of a crust perfectly baked. Even for those who had maintained a composed demeanor until now, the experience of tasting these desserts became overwhelmingly expressive. Their faces lit up in unrestrained joy, smiles spreading like sunlight across their features, laughter slipping freely as they compared bites, textures, and flavors. There was something almost ceremonial about the way the desserts were approached. The women lingered over each choice, sometimes hovering for several minutes before selecting a slice or spoonful. Their movements were careful, deliberate, as if this moment deserved reverence. The cakes were sliced and served with unspoken appreciation, each piece handled with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the harshness of life outside the mess hall walls. Fruit salad was passed along slowly, hands grazing lightly over one another as portions were offered, received and tasted. Even the smallest of gestures, a hesitant spoonful of pudding, the delicate brushing away of powdered sugar from a crust, the careful lifting of a slice of pie to avoid spilling its juices, became imbued with significance, elevating the act of eating to a shared ritual, a quiet celebration of abundance and care. The variety, however, was perhaps the most astonishing aspect of all. For women accustomed to rations and limited options, the sheer diversity of desserts was almost incomprehensible. Chocolate, vanilla, fruit, custard, and cream, all presented at once in forms both familiar and entirely new. The sweetness alone was a revelation, not cloying or artificial, but carefully balanced, each flavor layered with nuance. The women experimented eagerly, sometimes combining items on a single plate, tasting how one sweetness contrasted with another, how textures could complement or surprise. The act of tasting became a playful exploration, a quiet rebellion against the monotony of captivity, and a rare moment in which they could assert their curiosity and delight without fear or consequence. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the hall seemed almost suspended in time. Laughter, soft exclamations, and the gentle clatter of spoons against plates became a rhythm that pulsed with quiet energy. Eyes met across tables, conveying unspoken joy and astonishment, as if the simple act of sharing a dessert had created a bridge between the women that was stronger than words could convey. Occasionally, a glance toward the American guards revealed soft smiles, perhaps an acknowledgement of the subtle magic that had been conjured with nothing more than flour, sugar, and the care of preparation. There was a fleeting sense that, for a moment, the walls of the camp had softened, that the boundaries between captivity and freedom had blurred in the warmth of shared delight and the universal pleasure of taste. The smallest details did not go unnoticed. The way the powdered sugar glinted in the sunlight, dusting a crust like frost on early morning leaves. The way a thin layer of glaze on a fruit tart caught the light as it was lifted, shimmering like liquid jewels. The soft crumb of a perfectly baked cake, yielding gently beneath the touch of a spoon, releasing a warmth and scent that filled the senses. Every detail amplified the feeling of disbelief and awe, reinforcing the sense that this was not simply food, but an experience designed to elicit wonder, to awaken senses dulled by the harshness of life in captivity. The women drank in these details as eagerly as they sampled the flavors, their eyes reflecting a mixture of astonishment, gratitude, and a quietly profound joy that needed no words to express. By the time the women had tasted several desserts, the room was alive with a subtle, radiant energy. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing reactions, debating which was sweetest, which flaked best, which melted most luxuriously on the tongue. There was an unspoken agreement, almost instinctual, that this abundance was something to be cherished, not taken for granted. And yet, despite the awe and delight, there was no hesitation in their enjoyment. With each bite, they surrendered to the moment, embracing the sweetness and richness, the textures and colors, as if to remind themselves that even in a world dominated by conflict, small pleasures could still exist. Moments that were purely and undeniably human. The desserts, like the first course, became a silent connector, binding the women together through shared astonishment, delight, and quiet appreciation. Even the most stoic among them could not resist soft smiles, lingering glances, or the gentle clinking of spoons against plates as they explored each flavor. The mess hall had transformed yet again, this time into a gallery of culinary artistry, a space where simple ingredients had been elevated into objects of wonder and joy. Each slice, each spoonful, each fleeting taste was a story in itself, a narrative of care, creativity, and a subtle acknowledgement of humanity that transcended the boundaries imposed by war. In those moments, surrounded by glistening pies, layered cakes, rich puddings, and vibrant fruit, the Italian female POWs were not prisoners. They were witnesses to an almost miraculous abundance, participants in a quiet theater of taste and texture, where every bite carried emotion and every glance carried understanding. The joy was quiet but profound, the astonishment immediate but enduring. And as the last spoonfuls were lifted, powdered sugar dusting fingers and crumbs clinging to napkins, it was clear that this experience, this extraordinary variety, this unexpected indulgence, would linger in their memories long after the hall had been cleared and the trays returned to the kitchen. Even the simplest elements of the meal carried an extraordinary sense of wonder. The crisp salads, the buttered rolls, the steaming soups, things that might have seemed ordinary to those preparing them, felt like treasures to the Italian women sitting quietly at the long wooden tables. After the rush of astonishment from the first courses and the dreamy sweetness of the desserts, there came a gentle stillness, as though the entire room had exhaled. The women lingered, letting their senses settle, their eyes traveling over the remains of the meal with disbelief that so much care had been poured into something as simple as lunch. Steam still rose lazily from the last bowls of soup, curls of it drifting upward and dissolving into the shafts of golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled faintly, the tune of an American swing song barely audible, its cheerful rhythm strangely at odds with the hush inside the mess hall. For the women, each bite that remained was something to savor, not rush through. A spoon dipped into soup and lifted slowly, the broth glistening as it caught the light, small pieces of vegetables and pasta gliding beneath the surface like hidden jewels. The aroma was comforting, softly spiced, warm and earthy. To those who had known the bitter cold of hunger and the thin, grey gruel of military rations, the soup was more than food. It was warmth made tangible, a sensation that filled not only the stomach but the heart. The buttered rolls, their crusts golden and tender, left traces of melted butter on fingertips, tiny gleams of gold against skin roughened by the strain of wartime labor. One woman, perhaps in her 20s, broke her roll apart carefully, watching the steam rise from the soft, white interior. She smiled faintly before taking a bite, her eyes closing for a moment, as though she were memorizing the feeling, the texture, the taste, the quiet miracle of being able to eat something so soft, so freshly made. Around her, others did much the same. Some took their time, their gestures slow and deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Others shared quietly, sliding a piece of bread toward a neighbor, pouring a little extra soup into another's bowl, their small acts of generosity mirroring the care that had been extended to them. Conversation was sparse, but every word carried weight. There was wonder in their tones, disbelief that even in captivity there could exist such attention to detail, such consideration in the presentation of food. Perhaps it was intentional. Perhaps the Americans had done this deliberately to maintain morale, to soften the edges of confinement. Or perhaps it was simply the nature of the cooks, ordinary men and women who believed that a proper meal, even for prisoners, should be made with dignity. Whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. The guards, too, noticed, standing along the periphery, hands resting casually on belts or crossed over their chests. They observed the women with quiet curiosity. They didn't interfere. They didn't rush them. There was no shouting, no orders barked across the room. For once, the air wasn't charged with the invisible tension of authority and obedience. Instead, something gentler hung between the two sides, a fragile thread of mutual recognition. The guards saw not enemies, but people, faces softened by gratitude, eyes brightened by a kind of peace they had not seen in months. The women, for their part, saw not conquerors, but humans capable of small mercies. No words were exchanged, yet the understanding was there, woven through the clinking of spoons, the scraping of chairs, the quiet rhythm of breathing and tasting. The sunlight shifted gradually, moving across the wooden floor in golden bands. It caught the edges of the tables, the metallic gleam of spoons, the rippling surface of half-empty soup bowls. The camp outside remained silent except for the faint chirp of birds and the distant hum of a truck engine. But inside, the moment was thick with presence, a sense that time had slowed down, that the women had been granted a pause in the endless march of war. Their faces, still tired, still marked by months of uncertainty, carried a new softness now. The tension in their shoulders had eased. They leaned back slightly in their seats, some resting their elbows on the table, some folding their hands around warm mugs of coffee or tea that had appeared almost unnoticed, their aroma mingling with the fading scent of soup and bread. It was not luxury, not in the grand sense. There were no fine linens, no silverware, no tablecloths. The chairs were plain, the plates were metal, and the walls were bare. Yet in its simplicity lay a strange elegance. The colors were rich and real, the deep amber of broth, the pale gold of butter, the muted green of lettuce leaves, the faintly rosy hue of cheeks warmed by food and sunlight. The scene could have been mistaken for something domestic, something peaceful, were it not for the uniforms and the small, stenciled letters, POD, marking each woman's sleeve. And yet, that single detail only made the scene more powerful. For within the boundaries of captivity, these women were experiencing, perhaps for the first time in years, the comforting ordinariness of humanity. The conversation grew a little livelier as the meal drew on. The women spoke in low tones, their voices mingling softly like a chorus of wind through trees. Some laughed quietly at how they had hesitated earlier, too uncertain to eat. Others commented on the flavor of the soup or the bread, wondering aloud what herbs had been used, or whether the cooks had been trained chefs. A few even began to hum faintly along to the distant melody from the radio, the tune of an unfamiliar American song finding its way into their voices. The mess hall, once a place defined by silence and discipline, had transformed into something else entirely. A room filled with warmth, light, and the gentle rhythm of human connection. It wasn't lost on them that outside these walls, the world was still tearing itself apart. There were battles still raging, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered across continents. Yet inside this simple wooden hall, the chaos seemed to fade. Each sip of soup, each bite of bread, was a small act of defiance against despair, a quiet assertion that life could still contain beauty. They were prisoners, yes, but for this hour, they were also guests at a table of humanity, participants in a ritual that transcended language and nationality. As the last of the meal disappeared, a calm satisfaction settled over the room. Some of the women leaned back, their hands resting loosely in their laps, eyes half closed as though unwilling to let go of the moment. Others tidied their trays gently, arranging their spoons and cups with a precision that spoke of gratitude and respect. The guards exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, perhaps recognizing the importance of what had just unfolded. A few of them even stepped forward, collecting trays or offering extra napkins, their gestures awkward but kind. There was no hierarchy in those small interactions, no barrier of uniform or nationality, only a shared awareness that something rare had occurred. For a few lingering minutes, no one moved to leave. The women stayed seated, gazing quietly at the empty plates, at the crumbs that still dotted the table, at the last streaks of butter glistening faintly in the sunlight. It was a simple sight, yet deeply moving, a visual echo of contentment that words could not capture. Slowly, conversation resumed. Someone made a gentle joke about eating too much. Another replied with a quiet laugh. A third began to hum again, this time a tune from home, soft and wistful. The sound drifted through the hall like a thread of smoke, curling and fading into the still air. Eventually, the moment passed. The trays were gathered, the tables cleared, and the guards signaled softly that it was time to return to the routine of camp life. Yet the expressions on the women's faces told the story of something far more enduring than a meal. They walked back toward their barracks, not with the weary resignation of captives, but with the quiet serenity of people who had glimpsed something beautiful and unexpected, a reminder that compassion could survive even amid conflict. Their steps were slow, measured, their voices low but light, as if carrying with them the lingering sweetness of the experience. Later that evening, as the sky turned a deep, dusky blue and the camp settled into silence, the women would recall the meal in soft conversation. They would speak of the taste of the soup, the warmth of the bread, the kindness in the eyes of one of the guards. They would talk about how the sunlight looked on the wooden tables, how the smell of butter lingered in the air, how for a fleeting hour they had felt something close to peace. And in those quiet recollections, whispered beneath the hum of crickets and the distant clang of camp routines, the memory of that meal would take on a new shape. Not just food, but a symbol of resilience, of shared humanity, of the fragile beauty that could still exist in the shadow of war. In the years to come, when the war was over and the women were free again, they would remember that day. Some would tell their families about the food, the roasted chicken, the sweet desserts, but most of all about the simple soup and bread that had somehow carried more comfort than anything else. They would remember the way the light fell across the tables, the way silence turned to laughter, and how, for one miraculous meal, they had been treated not as enemies, but as guests in the fragile peace between nations. The memory of that day would endure like a faint, golden photograph in their minds, edges blurred by time, colors softened by nostalgia, but the feeling of warmth, of gratitude, of quiet astonishment remaining as vivid as ever. And though the world would move on reshaped and rebuilt, the story of that meal, the one where Italian female prisoners of war tasted the gentle variety of American kindness, would linger as a testament to something simple, something eternal, the way food, even in its humblest form, can remind us that beneath every uniform, every border, every battle, there beats the same human heart.